Scott, it's such a pleasure to have you on. There's a million topics I want to talk about, from the startup landscape, but I want to maybe start early in your career. And I've noticed that you have a law degree, and it's funny. My former business partner also he calls himself a reformed lawyer. So I'd like to maybe talk about, like why go into law, and also what led you out of law.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to spend a bit of time with you, my friend. So, law is a funny thing. I think myself, like many people who are young and kind of trying to figure out what to do with their careers, like law seemed like a an exclusive, if I do this career, people think I'm important. People think my girlfriend's parents will like me. Basically, what I'm saying is I got into law for all the wrong reasons. And I think a lot of law students um, do the same. There's a lot of smart people in law school, but there is, I think, a great deal of somewhat laziness, I think, with respect to really understanding what the career is, And so when I started law school, I had a lot of idealistic sort of views on what I would do with the career, and I didn't really have a clear picture of what being a lawyer day to day would be. Um, that's not to say that when I started working in law, I didn't really enjoy it, nor is it to say that I didn't learn a lot. But I do feel that at a certain point, you have to kind of make a decision about sort of the long term trajectory of your career. And what I realized after a few years of practice is that when I looked at the partners in my firm, none of them were the kind of people that I really, not with the utmost respect to them, but none of them were the kind of people who sort of I was. Like I felt like I was a much more risk seeking individual, and I felt like in order to be successful in law, you really need to have risk aversion as part of your DNA. It's sort of what you get paid the big bucks for is to be ultra detail orientated and to be hyper aware of the risks at all times. And I felt that that wasn't who I was. I'm sure I could have done my best to transform myself into that through rigorous practice. But I think that when you do something like that, when you kind of try to change who you are, you'll always lose to someone who is naturally that thing. So it was a realization that took a few years to settle in, but it made sense for me to move away from like the direct practice of law.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of self awareness because I think some people don't discover that till like much later, right? So I think it and then leads to regret. And it's funny, I've had this very specific conversation with my former partner JF, where it's he also did a similar move, went from law into tech, and it's a question of what can go right or what can go wrong. Are two very different questions to be asking, right? So like upside or downside. So like your point about risk, and then also your point about competition, right? Of like, well, someone that's really good at understanding this, I'm never going to be able to match them, right? Because it's not natural to me. It's not my skill set. So I'm good in other ways. Once you made that call, how did you, I know Jay from First Capital, which was, I guess, your next move. You went in as, as a principal and EIR. How did that come to be? And did you have that plan to then move into, it was like the original plan to move into startups, become entrepreneur? Or was it like the first, like the first, let's say, part of the journey and you were still discovering?
So, quite honestly, what I thought at first when I was moving away from law was, how can I get closer to the action? And like a lot of people in professional services, the answer is, oh, well, I'll work in VC. But I was super naive about the industry at that time. I had no idea how it really worked. I just kind of had like a high level understanding of it. And so I had networked really extensively into the space at that time. And I kind of saw that it was really different from what I expected. Like there is no path to partnership in a lot of firms. Um, there's like a glass ceiling in a sense if you don't have operational experience, or if you haven't, worked at least in a startup or been a founder. And then the whole kind of like LP, GP fundraising side of things was like a total mystery. And so I had kind of gone through that networking process and realized, hey, this isn't exactly what I thought it might be, and I might need to find a different avenue. And along that path, I met Dominic and Jay First of Ferst Capital Partners, two brothers with amazing operational experience with multiple exits who were really at the forefront of consumer facing fintech roundabouts 2014, I guess it would have been. Um, and they were just amazing. And I don't have a single bad thing to say about those guys. I think they're amazing investors, great mentors of mine, great company builders, and folks who I think anyone would be sort of would benefit from getting to know. And they gave me a shot, basically. They were trying to roll out a thesis about direct to consumer fintech that included businesses in wealth management, in banking, and they said to me, "Hey, look, we're trying to build something in insurance. There's been almost no activity or innovation in that industry, even as fintech was really sort of popping off." And so I had a chance to go into the discovery mode, search for business models, and then actually they became my first investors. And that's how I transitioned from professional services to being a founder myself.
That's a great story, man. That's a great story, and I like how you give a shout out, obviously to the people that mentored you along the way, and like First Capital, and around that period of time had a lot of hype, and not that we don't hear a lot about them today, but I feel that it was one of those like the stars aligned with your career and what you were trying to do. So talk to us about the journey founding Covera. I think you said kind of the embryo of the idea started at first. And then yeah, maybe explain a little bit what you had built.
Sure. And I think like it's funny you should say that about Dominic and Jay and First. And I think what was quite amazing was that these are two individuals who are investing their own capital, and there are no external LPs at all. And I think we'll probably get into sort of the bigger picture of the Canadian landscape, but I think um, it was interesting for me that my first sort of experience in innovation was in a somewhat like venture family office, I would call it. Like it's a bit of a hybrid company builder, direct investor, private equity fund. Like they do whatever they want because it's their capital, and there isn't the structure or requirement of like satisfying external parties, and that gives them an enormous amount of freedom. And so, if Dom and Jay are less visible, let's say, in 2023 and 2024 than they were back then, it's because they choose it, and it's because they've decided, well, like we're going to evolve our strategy, and some of it will be maybe less visible than it was back then. But I think that they're still doing exactly what they want, and I think that's every investor's goal. Now I'm an investor, and we have excellent LPs and amazing partners, but it definitely comes with a degree of what I would say compromise to an extent, because at the end of the day, like we're investing other people's money, and we have a mandate to deliver for our investors, and that has its pros and its cons, but it definitely is a slightly different style of investing than what Dom and Jay were doing back when we were business partners. Um, and so, but going back to like the idea of Covera and this whole kind of issue of direct to consumer fintech, and InsurTech, which when I started Covera wasn't even really like a hashtag at the time. And you know what was sort of immediately apparent is that customer acquisition at um, relatively relatively affordable a cost was sort of the name of the game. And I say relatively affordable because, like, regardless of how you acquire these customers in direct to consumer fintech, in general, it's going to be an expensive process. Um, and the trade-off is when you acquire those customers, they can potentially be very valuable and they can have very long lifetime customer values. So like a lot of the heuristics that I learned back then still inform like how I look at direct investments in fintech businesses today, especially when trying to understand B2B versus B2C and so on. But like in a nutshell, what we built at Covera, along with my co-founder Paul O'Reilly, um, we we built a digital insurance brokerage for home and auto insurance products. And as a way to sort of tackle this customer acquisition problem, we were looking for entry points that would allow us to uh, get in front of customers that weren't otherwise being marketed to. And we settled on what we called like a Trojan horse, which was this moment of renewals. And so when you look at personal lines insurance products, like the kind of policy you have like mandated by law when you drive a car, or mandated by your mortgage when you have a home, these are products with close to 100% market penetration, um, and almost 100% retention. So retention rates are, deep into the 90s. But if you do any sort of poking around to ask individuals, like, why do you renew your insurance? Like, it's never because they are happy with their provider or particularly delighted with the products that they're given. It's like a question of apathy. So Covera was a reshopping service that enabled people to seamlessly transition between different insurance providers at that renewal moment and at a moment when they wouldn't need to pay any renewal penalties. And so we would onboard customers not at mealtime, let's say, i.e., not when they're actually shopping for a policy. We would onboard them at any point of their policy lifecycle. We would bring on board all of the information necessary to underwrite them. And then at their renewal date, we would make proposals to them that they could switch to. And if they were already with the best possible provider, we would let them know and shop for them next year and potentially convert them next cycle. So, like, the concept was almost entirely about reducing customer acquisition costs, and in order to actually deliver on that promise, we needed to build quite a bit of software in the back end uh, to just make the brokerage process way more efficient. And that included, the touch points with consumers, but also with our insurance carrier partners who were underwriting the core products. The industry is enormously dominated by a small number of oligopolistic software providers, all of whom have like very poor quality products. And so a lot of our challenges had to do with how do we integrate with those providers? How do we coexist with them in a world where, like, notwithstanding the fact that we were just like a little rounding error of a company at the time, it was like sort of palpable that we were being perceived as a threat. Um, and so it was a complex sort of dance of balancing stakeholders, balancing customer acquisition, trying to build the business, trying to get cooperation from partners who, frankly, didn't really have much motivation to work with us. It was pretty character building.
Yeah, it sounds like a great journey, and I'm like, I feel like I want to dive into the weeds here about Covera. But like, so obviously, it seems like you guys had an interesting insight about how do you augment the customer experience, right? Which, like you said, is like a lot of people have apathy, which I think is the correct word. And you mentioned customer acquisition costs. I imagine you had to build a lot of internal skills when it came to like things like performance marketing, right? So acquisition on the big platforms. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did. I mean, so we did it in different ways. One thing that I sort of learned building Covera was that the performance marketing side of things, at least for the products that we were selling, was, I think, a lot of table stakes. Like, it was, I think, largely commoditized. But what was the hardest part was developing the creative and developing the messaging. And still to this day, when I think about founders working with marketing professionals, I that like bifurcation between like the creative side and like the Excel sheet, quantitative driven performance side of things is like pretty clear in my mind now. And so we experimented relentlessly with messaging. I had a lot of sort of late nights talking with with Dominic and Jay about this exact topic and try to figure stuff out. And then we worked with people inside and outside of Covera to just run campaigns and to be cost effective with our spend. So yeah, definitely the hardest part is like when you're I remember feeling like, wow, I wish I had a product that could like be visually represented really easily. I think some startups enjoy that as like an advantage, and some don't, right? And I think when you get to like, especially like sort of back end B2B solutions, when you talk about like products that aren't especially sexy, it gets a lot harder to to present them in a way that is appealing.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I had a little bit of experience having where invested in Breathe Life with Ian and what they've done, and seen them on their journey. And then yeah, maybe another time over drinks we can like talk performance marketing and dive into details. It was like it was for many years part of my life. So today I'm clueless, but I know enough to be dangerous. And I'd like to maybe talk about your exit from Covera. So like the acquisition, was it something that was planned? Was it when it happened? How like did you imagine your past legal helped you in the deal making aspect of it? So I'd like to hear a little bit about the path and also the emotional side of like starting something and then having to let go.
Yeah, great question. So like I think like, you know, to be totally transparent, like Covera was not a business that, we cracked it out of the park. I think we did okay. We had what I think most would call like a soft landing. We sold, we made some money. Things were great in that sense. But I still feel in some sense I had like a lot of unfinished business. Um, it was an intense period because we wanted to raise more capital. We were not successful at doing it, and I was in the situation where I needed to transition from like a fundraising process to like essentially the sale of the company. And yeah, when you have very little resources, you have to rely on salesmanship in some sense. And so I drove really hard with a lot of different conversations. And when the rubber met the road, I was able to get us to a point where we had two competing offers, and it was pretty intense. Because I remember like at one point it sort of became clear that I was sort of pitting one potential acquirer against the other, but I could sort of tell in the back of my mind that one of them was sort of losing interest, and that like it wouldn't necessarily be able to rely on them, and so we really had to white knuckle it through through that sale process. And I remember sitting in a room with the group of individuals who ultimately acquired us and just playing poker, and basically, and it was a we weren't literally playing poker. I mean, I was bluffing, and was able to nonetheless get a good result, which was it felt great. It felt exhilarating at the time, and I think I got the best possible outcome that I could have for myself and for my co-founder and for our investors. And I mean, that's really all I can really ask for. I think it was a wild ride. I went from literally being a lawyer with zero startup experience to like selling my own company within, I think, a span of about 4.5 years or so. And yeah, reflecting on it, it was a very intense time. I loved it, but I also thought it was extremely challenging.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine, man. And I find it's like, it's so kudos to you for having gone through that process. And, like, yeah, we could talk about the business experience and how much, elevates you from a career perspective, but also just the personal journey of understanding, what you like, what you're good at, what you don't like. And then, like you said, the emotional side of it a little bit. So yeah, I want to say it seems like now you're in a pretty good position to be, the consigliere to startups that are living this journey somewhere in that that through line, be it beginning, middle, or the end. you've seen you have your own kind of like experience that you could build upon, which I
Yeah,
find is invaluable.
yeah, I mean, and I think that like ties into what makes sense for me joining an early stage fund. Like I'm not someone who would necessarily be at home in like a growth stage VC fund doing Series Bs and Cs. Like it's not exactly my cup of tea, nor is it like where my skills sort of line up. Um, but I can have very empathetic conversations with founders at the early stage, um, and a lot of it ends up. Like the moments where you kind of can connect with founders, in my opinion, are those where you can kind of like let down like your guard a bit and allow them to do the same. I think that there's this like relentless pressure to like always be killing it, which is frankly like nonsense. The reality is it's an incredibly lonely job. Being a CEO is a very tough thing because you are the only person who understands your business to like a very granular level. And I mean that like you you're isolated from your mentors, you're isolated from your friends, from your family because you know they just don't have the clear visibility on what's going on in your company the way you do. And so it becomes very difficult at times to get the help that you need. And there's no shortage of people who want to have an opinion about what you need to do next. And it takes like quite a bit of discipline to take that feedback in and be sort of measured in how you consume it and implement it because it's so much easier to like comment from the outside, you know. Yeah, and then just like from like the day to day perspective of how hard it is like I remember coming home from like work or from the office, and just being like completely emotionally unavailable to my wife, and just like essentially wanting to just like stare into the like a dot on the wall for the rest of the evening. And you know, I had so much support from her, and I think like the hard it must have been hard for her because I didn't have it in me to necessarily explain on a day-to-day basis like why I was like feeling the way I was feeling. And when you are dealing with every aspect of a company, the kinds of things that will cause your day to go from like a good to a terrible day are so like laden with nuance that like in order to explain to someone you love why you're frustrated that day might require 20 minutes of preamble. And you just don't have the energy for it. You're totally toast at the end of those days. And so, I kind of became aware of that, and I realized that I needed to be a lot more open in my communication with my friends and with my family with respect to like what specific things I do every day, because that would lower the startup friction of me being able to explain my current state. Does that make sense?
100%, man. Yeah, 100%. I feel like you're bringing a lot of points. I was just like a kind of joint therapy session uh, on the startup life and what it means. And you mentioned something I've never really thought about, this notion of like taking the half an hour to explain to a loved one, like you mentioned your wife. And it's like the same thing for me. It's like my wife's, I've had a bad day, we lost a client or something happened, or a situation with a colleague. And it's like, you just spent an hour debating it with your partners, your co-founders. Do you really want to go home and talk about the same thing? And
Yeah,
then having to
exactly.
like give all that, like the context for,
No fucking way you're
your
doing that, right? Exactly.
exactly. Yeah. So going back to this notion of loneliness, it's like, well, no, I prefer to kind of bury it down, heads down, keep moving forward.
Yeah, have a
And
couple beers, right? I
yeah,
mean, honestly,
exactly.
like
Yeah.
it's a problem, right? Like it's like that kind of like that kind of thing. It leads to that isolation. It leads to like I'm sure that a lot of founders will identify with the fact that like having alcohol or weed or whatever like at the end of your day is like it could easily become something that isn't um, isn't like healthy, is that it becomes something that you're using it to escape, the difficulty of your situation. That's definitely something that I've seen happen to others. And so, yeah, it's something that I try to have a transparent conversation with founders today, like at Covera.
Yeah,
Sorry, at
yeah,
Panache,
yeah. Of
Russell
course.
Brimley.
Then you mentioned this medication, the self medication piece, and you're going back to your investor hat today. And obviously we make a good segue to Panache here, but I find it's very lacking, at least maybe in the Canadian landscape. And I'd love to hear you because I'm new to the space, and I feel that there's not enough investors that have operational experience, that have founded companies, so they don't necessarily have that empathy of understanding that you could provide advice, but you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. Even tip of the iceberg is maybe not the right analogy, because you said it's like, the founder, CEO, and the management team, they have just like 99.9% much more information as to what's going on. So like the do X of like, here's exactly what you should do is like, I think it's well intentioned, but sometimes it's like, you're only looking maybe at the dollars necessarily, or the numbers of the strategy side, but not necessarily the human side of the element. So you bring in something that brings in like, hey, I understand where you're coming from. You have empathy, which is a good starting point to have a more robust conversation. Especially being an investor today. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, so I think that there's like this. I don't think it's impossible for someone without operational experience to be a great investor. I mean, for sure you can. Like, it's not a lot of it is not rocket science, I think that there's just like you have to find your own way, and you have to find your own approach. Um, it's it can be easier to connect with founders when you have, let's say, very specific tactical examples that come from your operational experience. But if you have those from other areas of your career or other moments in your life, that's fine. And so I don't want to I never want to like sort of imply that ought to be some kind of gatekeeping um, associated to like being an investor. But I think like the moment that the investor begins to overstep and starts to be really prescriptive and starts to like, I guess, go past what is sort of like advice and go more towards like what is like telling a founder what to do, then I think it's fair for that founder to have a higher degree of like scrutiny on like, why do you know what you're saying? you know and like, just like, so if I'm telling a founder, hey, look, this is exactly what you need to do in order to IPO a business, I expect them to be like, well, how do you know? I didn't IPO Covera, right? And so I think that there is 100% like tons of value that can be created by investors that don't have hardcore operational experience. I think it just means that you need to kind of play to your strengths and use your experience in whatever context you have it, to the greatest sort of benefit that you can, and to be aware of where you shouldn't overstep, just like anyone does. So yeah, it's definitely helpful to have that experience. Um, and sometimes it's just a great icebreaker, when you're having those first conversations with founders. Um, because like, generally speaking, by the time we meet with teams, we're rarely the first people they've ever spoken with. And one of the things that you develop when you are a founder is like a deep sort of awareness of how much bad behavior occurs between VCs and founders. And so I like to acknowledge that up front. When you have founders show up and their armor's on, they've got their pitch inflection going and all that sort of thing. It's like, great, but like, how are you doing? Because chances are, they've been ghosted by two or three investors in the last few days. They've had, blow ups with maybe their co-founder. There's a whole bunch of things that you can kind of immediately identify, and that helps me, I think, create connection with founders quickly. hopefully get to understand what they're working on in an accelerated fashion.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really good feedback. And so yeah, maybe why join Panache? Like, what led you to after the exit want to join? Like a seed, pre-seed firm, and like I know some of the folks there is obviously very strong team, but maybe just your own personal rationale.
Yeah. So after I sold Covera, I I took some time to just sort of enjoy life. Um, I wanted to I wanted to sort of recharge. I I got like a co-working space by myself, and just enjoyed a period where I was just reading all the books I wanted to read and sort of reflecting and writing and so on. And just as I was sort of ready to say, okay, I'm ready to get back in the game, like COVID happened, and my wife works in healthcare, and it was a pretty kind of bizarre time. Like no one knew what was happening. For all we knew, this was going to cause hemorrhaging eyeballs, you know, and so everyone was very careful, and I turned into sort of like holding down the fort at home while my mom was my mom my wife was working in these long term care facilities where seniors were dying and by the dozens and so on, and so that took a while, very strange period in everyone's life, I'm sure, but along the way I was picking up sort of interesting opportunities. I tried a couple different things. I was working with a gentleman here in Montreal who was in the process of digitizing a commercial bank in the U.S. and the project had somewhat kind of gone off the rails because of some like undisciplined project management by some of the team, and so I kind of hopped into that, helped clean that up, helped get that back on track, work with development teams in India and here and here. So that was something I worked on. I also joined a kind of a false started prop tech accelerator slash company builder that was potentially going to be an area where I would build a new business, and that for reasons that were totally bizarre and completely outside of my control just sort of like broke up into pieces. Um, and I was actually trying to build another company. I was working with a good friend of mine who was a really strong uh, engineer at Google uh, who had this idea of building a no code platform for algorithmic trading. And so the concept was to give algorithmic trading tools to retail investors. And he was in love, I think, with the technical challenge of building such a product because it was a deep product on the tech side. But I was doing customer discovery, speaking with traders and prop shops and individuals, and like everything I was getting back was like, hey, like this isn't going to work. Your customers are going to go bankrupt constantly because algorithmic trading is no joke, and so I was sort of like at this period where that felt like it was sort of losing steam, and I was doing some coaching work at an accelerator for fintech called District 3 out of Concordia University, and through that I met Mike Sagelski, who's now my partner, and he recruited me to join Panache, who at the time were looking for a partner here in Montreal. So after a pretty long get to know you period, I got to know Pat Lore out of Calgary, Prashant Mata out of Toronto, and then I agreed to join. Shortly thereafter, we acquired Commonwealth Ventures. Panache Ventures acquired Commonwealth Ventures, which was run by Chris Newman out of SF, and he joined as our fourth partner, fourth investing partner, I should say, because Mike is still my partner, and he's based out of Vancouver.
Yeah, it's a great story. That's a great story, and obviously you guys have like a really solid team. And yeah, let maybe hear the Panache pitch a bit, right? Like so, seed, pre-seed, types of companies, ambition for the fund. Yeah, give us the spiel.
Yeah. So look, we do pre-seed and seed investing only. We have no short or medium term goal to go up the chain and start doing Series A, Series B, that kind of thing. We know pre-seed really well. We know seed really well. That's what we know how to do. That's what our team knows how to do. And we want to be the best in the world at it. We're a long way off from that. We'll start with trying to be the best in Canada, but after that, I want to keep going, and I want to really benchmark ourselves off of the best funds in the world. Um, but I mean, more precisely, like we're a fund that writes 250 to $1 million checks. We're often the first money in after friends and family. We like to lead our rounds, and we're looking for the most ambitious founders that we can find. Um, you know, in the back in the day, I think there was this perception that Panache was a fund that was sort of doing like a spray and pray approach. Um, and I think that comes from the fact that the sort of precursor fund that for Panache was 500 startups. So 500 startups Canada was started by Mike and Pat and others. And it was a small fund writing, I believe, 150K checks. This is well before my time, so I might be putting my foot in my mouth on some of the specific. But basically, it was modeled after as in what I guess you could kind of think of as like a franchise model off of like the prolific SF fund 500 startups. Um, and I think that history led to this perception that Panache would just sort of write lots of checks, build this like unsustainably large portfolio that would have like no support, and then would just sort of like cash out whenever possible as sort of dumb money. And that was never the intention of anyone involved at either 500 Startups Canada or Panache. I think it really just is. I personally think that the model reflected both then and now in our approach is the right way to do pre-seed and seed investing in Canada. Like we're 40 million people now. Like we're like roughly the same size as California, right? And I don't believe that there's enough depth in any specific sector to do geographically constrained, stage constrained investing uh, in this country, right? Like I think that our specificity and our expertise is in working with early stage founders. And I think whether you're building a B2B SaaS business or a FinTech business, there's a great deal of commonality between the kinds of challenges you're going to face as you stand up that business from zero. And on our team, we have a lot of depth across lots of different sectors that we pull from. So, whether you're a fintech business and you get sort of advice from myself or from Prashant, who has a lot of knowledge in the space, or a prop tech business, which in a lot of cases is essentially fintech adjacent, or whether you're a very technical founder and you work with someone like Chris, who had built like multiple data specific businesses out of SF, or whether you're doing something where you're really scaling up, like Pat, who built iStock Photo. Like we have lived experiences that are useful to you. And I think balancing sort of the practical constraints of investing in Canada with our obligation to deliver returns to our investors, like this, in my opinion, I wouldn't have joined another fund because I believe in this process and I believe in the need for this stage of funding. And I think that we can do it really, really well. So we had, and like, look, and it's also just amazing to join a team where like the ambition is high. I've been on a lot of teams in my life, and there's a lot of times where I felt that, uh, you know, like I just think it's really rare that you get to join a team where everyone wants to be an absolute killer.
Yeah, what's that expression? Chips in shoulders, but chips in pockets, right? So, like, I think there's a little bit of like, let's try and swing for the fences, from what I understand. So, yeah, I
Hell
love the
yeah.
approach.
Yeah. Why not us? That's
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
like to think. Why not me? Why
yeah,
not us? Why not
mm,
Canada? Why not our
mm,
founders? Right? Like,
yeah. Before we talk about maybe the Canadian landscape, just maybe on the personal side, like, what's the biggest difference so far, having gone from founder operator to investor? Like, any lessons, even though like maybe I'm sure you consider it still early in your journey.
yeah, like I think look, you work a lot as a VC, but like there's no comparison um, to being a founder. Like being a founder, um, you like for the reasons we talked about earlier, like the isolation and loneliness and so on. Like you are ultimately accountable. Like this is I don't think what people talk about enough. It's like when you are a founder, you have told everyone you know that this is what you're doing. So like think about all the people who like you didn't like in high school. Like they know that you're like broadcasting this on LinkedIn and you're like writing these like blog posts, like you're essentially faking it till you make it. Like let's be honest, right? And it's a real dice roll. And that pressure is enormous. You know, your friends, your family, people you love, people who hate you, they all know what's going on, right? And so that pressure is something that is like it's meta to the actual sort of like work that you do day to day. And so even if the number of hours that I put in hasn't really changed much relative to when I was a founder, like the quality or the type of pressure that I'm placed under is entirely different. And like I try to remember that.
Yeah, it goes back to the the conversation before about perspective that you bring to the table, right? So like one of the ways to be a good investor is to have that perspective. And now that you've done quite a few deals, and like like obviously you said it's not the, I love the insight in terms of portfolio construction as to how you approach it, more concentrated than spray and pray. What are your thoughts about the pre-seed seed stage here in Canada? Like, how would you juxtapose it to the markets, or any other insights that that you've gleaned so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it's extremely difficult to raise pre-seed and seed funding. And it's certainly harder in 2023 and will be in 2024 than it was like a couple of years ago. Um, but there's also a lot of like public infrastructure available to founders that I think has like has certainly has benefits, but certainly comes with trade-offs. You know, my my feeling is that there's different kinds of like there's different kinds of businesses and like well how should I say this? I mean, I think when you actually are showing up at a pitch meeting um, with Panache or with any early stage fund as a founder, there is sometimes there's just going to be structural things with the business that frankly mean that you're not a venture scale company. Um, and I wonder sometimes to what degree, like the perception that it's hard to raise capital is being perpetuated by companies that simply ought to be doing something else. And that sounds pretty harsh until you think through, like, well, what is the implication of that? Because in a normal situation, normal, I don't know how you define normal, maybe just like in the Bay Area, let's say, um, it would be far more likely that a founder would build something, get a slide deck together, get some angel capital in, take it to market, do their best, see it's not working. 18 months later, shut it down, call it a day, switch, focus, and start something new. Right? Like that's like that can be a fast process, and it could be an extremely valuable one for a founding team, such that when they start their new business in 19 months, um, they are starting with so much more seasoning, and the kinds of mistakes they're going to make, like they've learned them, and it's over, right? And they can discard a lot of the original sin of maybe whatever that model was that made it sort of just not able to work. In Canada, we have a lot of life support for companies that are never going to make it. And I think what ends up happening is that some of these founders, instead of it being an 18-month cycle, it becomes a 3-year cycle or a 5-year cycle or a 7-year cycle. And by the time they get out of this sort of idea that isn't going to work, they are completely and utterly exhausted and they are burnt out and they go back to working at like a 9 to 5 job, and that sucks. That shouldn't be what happens. Like And I think that that is like an unintended consequence of having these support structures, which ostensibly are intended to boost like innovative output in our country, but I think have the unintended effect of keeping people in the game on specific ideas for too long, letting them burn out, letting them burn all the way out, right? Whereas if we just like cut to the chase with some of these founders, let them like shed that skin and get them back into the game in a quicker cycle, then we're going to have more winners because we're going to have more multi-time founders, and I know it's easy to say for me because I'm on the outside of that and I'm not like living it. I'm not trapped in a business that isn't going anywhere. But like, let's be honest, there are a lot of those. And, I think sometimes like that the narrative about the difficulty of raising capital is driven by individuals who are in that position. And what they need to do in some cases is quit, and I don't say quit for good. I mean, like, okay, like that's my first like notch on my bedpost. Next, let's go on. Like, what are we doing next? Right. And if you can get that cycle going quicker in Canada, you get people learning faster. You get seasoned entrepreneurs who are on their second, third business by the time they're in their early 30s. Like now you're dealing with high quality, high throughput people who aren't going to make mistakes and who have networks and who have seen a few things. And I don't know how we build an ecosystem that optimizes for that. But my perception is that that is an issue.
Yeah, I find it's a fascinating insight, Scott. I've never really thought of it that way, right? So this notion of volume, right? So getting founders, because we're limited, if you look at it from a funnel, like there's a limited set of founders that are going to want to start something, right? So how do we support those people? And part of it is actually letting them have multiple at bats because that increases the frequency and the odds, right? You mentioned some of the support structures, what and feel comfortable to share or not. Like, what do you think are some of those support structures that maybe should be reconsidered or their resources should be allocated differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of founders that I've met who've gone through 4 or 5 different accelerators, right? Like, at what point are you? Is there diminishing returns for that process? You know, that would be an
Shred
example.
credits. Yeah, sorry, cut you off, but it's like I think shred
Yeah,
credits is
look,
another one. If you ask me, like
Shred is
because they
amazing though.
and
Like
it,
so,
yeah,
yeah. No, I think Shred's amazing. I think Shred is amazing. When I was fundraising for Covera, I would head down to SF and I would like talk to people there, and founders would be like, "Well, what are you even doing here? I heard that the government pays for 75% of your developer salaries." And I was like, "Yeah, it's true." Like Shred is amazing, and my partner Prashant is currently involved in a lobbying process to try to have Shred extended to compute for AI startups that need to invest enormous amounts into GPUs, which I think could also be pretty transformative if that were to ever come to fruition. Um, so yeah, no, Shred I think is an amazing incentive. When you think about it, it's like Shred implies that there are people working on products somewhere and that the product is innovative in nature. Like you can't get shred credits for integrating into like the APIs of some backend system. Like you get shred credits because you're doing something that is somewhat innovative. And I think the government does a pretty good job of like interpreting what innovative means. I don't think it's too harsh, nor do I think it's too easy to get shred. I think it's sort of just the right amount. Um, but I also think that we've picked up a ton of infrastructure during the boom years of VC. And like maybe it's a little bit politically incorrect for me to say this, but I think that there's a whole lot of people who saw what was very exciting during the bull run of the last 15 years or so, and they're like much like I did at one point in my life. I was like, oh, I want to get closer to the action, and so they wanted to get closer to the action. And so what's a way to get closer to the action without actually putting your chips on the table and becoming an entrepreneur? Well, it's, creating a corporate VC or creating a corporate accelerator or doing one of these many sort of like coaching programs and so on. Um, and that scratches the itch that you're being involved in or getting yourself involved in like an exciting area of the economy. But how many of these people are going to be around, you know, as the momentum of the startup scene slows over the next few years? Like, I think we're going into a period, we're going to shed a lot of dead here, and I think that rationalization is probably needed. Um, because like I said, we're a small market. And if we have too many institutions, we are going to dilute the quality of those institutions, and the kinds of people, the kinds of help, the kinds of value they can create is going to be diffused over a greater number of entities rather than concentrated in a small number of super high quality world class entities.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I also go back to your first point about too many accelerators and the appearance of doing work rather than doing the work. Right, those are two key things that kind of take away. In terms of like getting shit done, like what's your personal ambition? Like, how do you feel that we can actually move the ecosystem forward? You brought forth a few ideas, but maybe to poke you a bit more on it. Like, what else can we do? And like maybe even is Panache trying to do more than just investing on this front?
I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done very early. I think that the greatest like leverage point that accelerators have is during the ideation phase. I think that we should be doing more to help founders validate their ideas, and everybody knows the verbiage of customer validation at this point. Like, there's no founder that shows up to pitch Panache that doesn't know that they should use the words customer discovery and customer validation and interviews and stuff. But I swear, man, you push them on this, and you'll find out that they're going to say they did 300 interviews. In reality, they did 80, and in reality, the 80 was done 3 years ago, and they haven't done any since. Like, there is not a rigorous application of like the scientific method of discovering business models that's happening here. We use the words, but a lot of two-sided marketplaces for whatever are still being launched today in Canada. A lot of CRMs for the whatever industry are still being launched, and these are effectively Me Too companies. Okay. And it's going to be hard to win when you're coming out of a small market like Canada, about 5, 6, 7 years too late to the party for those business models. And that's not to say that you can't still build an effective two-sided marketplace in Canada in 2024 or 2023. But you better know like what it's going to take. You shouldn't be getting any coaching from VCs or accelerators on that front if that's where you're putting your chips in the table, right? And so, like, the question for me is like of one of timing, right? Like, if we want more companies to be funded, I think that there's like the accelerators absolutely positively can play a critical role in helping founders de-risk those ideas early, right? But then once you're like up and running with a business idea, like, their leverage to kind of move you in a different direction and one that maybe is more sustainable or more likely to win, it's much harder at that stage.
Yeah, Scott, I think we could probably take another hour. So it's like, I think I'll need to do a round two interview at some point with you because I think you have such a wealth of knowledge about the space and such great ideas. And you speak plainly, but I think there's a lot of intellectual work that's been done to kind of, to bring forth your ideas. Maybe final question is like, if there's any early stage startups out there listening to this, what's the best way to get in contact with Panache, pitch you guys in a way that would optimize their chances?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. And I think what I feel about Canadian VCs and founders and that relationship is as follows. It's always sort of, well, it's very often spoken that like, hey, it's very hard for founders to raise capital, which is true. Okay. But like the yin to the yang is that it's very hard for funds to find good companies. Like it is a two-sided search. Okay. And so every fund in Canada is trying to find you. And so if you can't get a meeting with any VC that you want in Canada, you're doing something wrong. Okay. Because we're out here trying to reach you. And so how do you do that? I think there are there are different ways. Obviously, referrals is like the number one thing everyone always says. Hey, if you can get a warm referral, great. And that's true. I will take referrals very, very frequently. Like high degree of success. If someone I know in my network says, "Hey, you should talk to this company," we will definitely talk to you. And like in general, my philosophy with how I deal screen at Panache is that it's really easy to get a first meeting with us. In my opinion, it's a lot harder to get a second meeting, but everyone gets 30 minutes with us. And so if you can reach us, there's a high likelihood of success that you're going to have a chance to take your shot. Okay. Now, if you don't have referral networks, which is the case for many founders, and this is especially true when you talk about like non-traditional founders, BIPOC founders, women founders, and so on. Like, how do you get referral networks if you didn't grow up in an environment where you're surrounded by finance people and business people? Well, like events are it. you know, like we're hosting events constantly. We are attending cocktails constantly. And when I say we, I'm going to just like pontificate as the proverbial VC across Canada, because I think I can speak for everyone when I say like we're constantly at events, cocktails, and so on. Like just show up to those places. You will be able to access us. And the approach, and like this is more a tactic that I would use rather than like a generalized piece of advice, but like my view is that when you meet someone at a cocktail, you're not trying to sell your business at that moment. You're not trying to get a check at that moment. You're just trying to get on their calendar, right? And so be efficient about it. Go into all these cocktails, go to all these conferences with a hit list of people that you want to actually make contact with. Research who they are ahead of time. Make contact with them digitally if you can through LinkedIn or through email first. Find them at the cocktail, and it's like, hey, I'm so and so. I'm building this for this. I'd love to take 20 minutes or 30 minutes, in the coming weeks to chat about it. Can I reach out to you? How do I reach out to you? Boom. And like, what is that VC going to say? No problem. Here's who you email. Talk to my associate or email me directly. Here's my email. Add me, whatever it is. Done. Okay. And that's your mission complete for that networking context. I'll say one thing before I kind of go into like the next step, because I think like what's really important for founders is that they understand that like the process of getting a venture check is like topical by stage. But like set that aside for a moment. I want to talk about cold calling for a second, because like cold calling is one of those things where people tend to think, hey, it's not possible, or VCs don't take cold calls. I disagree. I think cold calling is extremely effective, but you have to do it properly. If you cold call in such a way that it just literally looks like it was procedurally generated by MailChimp, I will like control delete those every single time. If you like reach out to me and like show that you actually know who I am, and that there's a reason why you're reaching out to me, and that there's like some degree of human behind the message, like there's a good chance that we're going to meet within a couple days, if not a week or two. And so I encourage you to find a cold calling method that works for you. And I'll tell you what my hack was when I was a founder. What I would do is I would look at a VC's social channels. I would look at some Twitter post or blog post that they wrote, and then I would flatter them about that in an initial message, because all VCs have these like giant egos, including myself. And it's like, oh, like suddenly it's like more than just, hey, like we have this, this SaaS product for X industry. Like figure out what works for you and do it. Okay. But going back to like this sort of like engagement process from founder to like first meeting you to a check, like the first thing you want to do is just get on their calendars, right? And so you're gonna think of that as like, this is my communication objective for this encounter that I'm gonna have at this cocktail, at this conference, at this whatever, right? Then from there, you're gonna do your first pitch, and the first pitch is gonna be short, right? Generally speaking, it's gonna be 30 minutes or so, and again, the objective, like what is the point of that 30-minute meeting? The point of that 30-minute meeting is to entice a VC to invest greater time into diligencing your business, right? So you don't have to answer every single question in that first meeting, in the sense that you don't have to get them to the point where they're so high conviction that they're ready to write you a check. I mean, sometimes it will happen, right? But all you're trying to do is distinguish yourself from the other companies that they have seen that week. Because I guarantee you, whether you're a SaaS business or a FinTech company or whatever, like you're going to be cross-shopped against all kinds of different companies that are, even though they feel very, very different to you, that are competing for the same bandwidth of a small group of individuals inside a fund who have to decide what are the businesses we want to diligence, right? Once you're in that diligence pipeline, okay, yeah, there's a whole new playbook, and we could talk about that another day. But I think in general, from a tactical level, the way I would kind of think about things today as a founder is find a way to get into their calendars and then find a way to capture them and capture them emotionally such that they become obsessed with your business as opposed to all the others they saw that week. If that's the case, then they're going to dig in. And when they dig in, that's your chance to shine. And so you have to kind of be realistic about the steps required to get a VC or an investor or an angel or whoever across the line. It doesn't all happen at once. And the more you understand that process, the better you'll be able to game it. To be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that's a really great feedback and insight, Scott. It's giving me an idea. It's like, oh, maybe a VC basics series, and have different investors like yourself maybe to come on. But anyways, I'll pitch you the idea another time. I want to be respectful. We've gone over already. I just want to thank you for your time, Scott, and we should definitely do a round two. Maybe final question: if people want to reach out, learn more, what's the best way to connect with Panache? No, beyond startups, but your socials, etc.
Yeah, sure. So, anyone who wants to reach us, they can go to www.panache.vc. There is a place where they can upload a slide deck and fill out a questionnaire about who they are. They're going to be asked at some point where they are, like where in Canada they are, and like we look at every single one of those, and you'll get feedback. And so you'll be sort of directed to the right partner in the right region, and you'll be able to get feedback on your deck and or have a first meeting or like make progress through the pipeline. So we're we're reading our DMs is another way of putting it.
Awesome, Scott. Thank you so much for your time, man. This was great.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.